The story I want to share with you today is a story about common men doing extraordinary things and willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of freedom. It's a story that will influence the use of technology in warfare to this very day. We'll set the table with some context of what was going on between the spring of 1775 and late summer of 1776 that influenced David Bushnell and creation of what came to be known as the turtle. We'll explore a little bit of background on David Bushnell, talk about some of his influences. We'll go through the turtle the most. We'll talk about how it came to be, its purpose, its construction, components, how it worked, and the battle that precipitated its first use. We'll talk about that first mission for the turtle. We'll talk about some outcomes and what can we can learn from David Bushnell and his turtle invention. And if anytime during this anybody wants to jump in and ask a question, I'm more than happy to accommodate as we go, however you'd like to do it. So first, let's take a look at some significant dates. This isn't a lesson per se to be this isn't supposed to be a history lesson to test everybody on their date knowledge, but this is just to set the framework for what was going on when Bushnell came up with this invention and what was going on in the colonies during that time. Uh, so between the spring of 75 and summer of 76, hostilities obviously had been going on for some time before the summer of 76. These dates are just a few that represent the rising temperature in the colonies, how protests and skirmishes became a movement, and how a movement became a fight for an independent nation. They provide an indication of the degree to which the Patriots would go and the influences that would lead to the historic event in the late hours of September 6th of 1776 and into the early hours of September 7th. Let's first take a look at Mr. Bushnell and his background. David Bushnell was born in what's now Westbrook, Connecticut, on the Long Island Sound, near the mouth of the Connecticut River. His interest in all things nautical was influenced by where he lived along the Long Island Sound. He entered Yale in 1771 at the young age, or what was considered a little bit older at that time, of 31. At Yale, Bushnell was studying religion, mathematics, geometry, and natural philosophy, which at the time was natural sciences. He had access to all the latest scientific literature while at Yale to support his interests and experiments. He left Yale at the outset of hostilities in the spring of 1775, believing that technology would be a key to winning the war. While at Yale, Bushnell, with his colleague Phineas Pratt, invented a process for igniting gunpowder underwater. A fervent patriot, Bushnell thought that surely this invention could be brought to bear in the fight against the British. But how would he deliver this device to a target that he knew would be under heavy guard? Thus, the idea was conceived of a submersible vessel to be used to ferry and attach mines to ships. With his brother Ezra Bushnell, who was a New England farmer, they set off to design and build this submersible delivery vessel. Not only had this type of military tactic ever been used or ever been attempted before, this type of vessel had never been built before. He faced several challenges from the outset, such as how is he going to propel this vessel? How to surface, submerge, and maintain depth. As you know, during this time, everything was in a two-dimensional space. It was left, right, and forward. Actually, let's just say, yeah, a little reverse unless you were in a bad situation. So he had to figure out how to deal with that third dimension of depth. How was he going to supply air to the vessel? How was he going to navigate at night while underwater? He couldn't use a candle because a candle, when the hatch was closed, would have consumed the oxygen much faster and therefore shortened his mission time. How was he going to measure the depth he was at? And how was he going to attach a mine while he was submerged? These photos that you see here in the slide were from a 2003 project called Making History. It was a collaboration between an organization called Hans House Studios, the Massachusetts College of Art, and the U.S. Naval Academy to build a working replica of Bushnell's turtle. The hull was carved from these massive oak trees, banded together by wrought iron strapping and covered in tar for a watertight seal. The mechanical systems had to be made by skilled craftsmen, such as the brass valves, the pumps, the bell, which was the hatch on top, that were made by another colleague of Bushnell from his time at Yale, a clockmaker named Isaac Doolittle. There was no going to Home Depot and pulling these parts off the shelf. Everything had to be made from scratch. The mine, at the time known as a torpedo, was Bushnell's own invention, aided by his academic colleague Phineas Pratt and Isaac Doolittle, who, because he was a clockmaker, knew all about timing mechanisms. Now, the turtle itself began in early 1776, and then it became known. He didn't set out for it to be called the turtle, but when he was finished, that was the nickname that was bestowed, and then it stuck. The turtle itself measured 8 by 6 by 3 feet, had the volume to support only 30 minutes of air for one person when submerged, and could move through the water at a whopping 3 miles per hour. The mine, which measured 2.5 by 1.5 feet, contained 150 pounds of gunpowder and used a time-delayed flintlock mechanism to initiate the explosion. Once the turtle was completed, it had to be tested, obviously, and a pilot needed to be trained. Bushnell was the inventor and the brains behind the operation, but he was far from the brawn and strength and stamina that was required for this type of a mission. For that, he enlisted his farmer, who was his brother, who was a farmer, Ezra Bushnell. So I sent along some diagrams. Do people have those handy? Just in case you
Yeah.
can't see it here. Okay, great, 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 great. Thank you for doing that, by the way. Um, so I'm just going to go through some of the components to start, again, setting the stage for why this was such an amazing invention and what made it so difficult to carry out. It was designed to operate on the surface with the hatch shut, then submerge only as it neared the target to avoid detection, and then plant the mine. To submerge, the pilot would open a foot valve to let water into the water ballast tank down there, and therefore become less buoyant and therefore submerge. To surface, the pilot would use a hand pump to force the water out and therefore be more buoyant and rise to the surface. The vertical screw propeller was used for finer depth control. Variable lead ballast could be released in the increments as needed to adjust buoyancy, as well as for what we called in the submarine service, if needed, an emergency surface. You could drop it and arise to the surface much quicker than normal. It was a horizontally propelled uh, vessel by a screw propeller on the bow, as opposed to today's vessels. And it was turned by hand and by these treadles by feet. Treadles are, if you want to think about the old sewing looms, where the operator of the loom would move the wheel with their feet. That's what a treadle is. While the pilot would then also steer the ship with the rudder. Both the vertical and horizontal propellers were invented by Bushnell to resemble windmills and perform like oars. And of course, sail and oar were the means of propulsion of the day. So here again, you can see all these amazing inventions that came to be from these extraordinary and common men. While on the surface, air came in through a snorkel valve, which I can imagine if you can think of one of those kids scuba masks or a skin diving mask, had that little ball at the top of the snorkel. That's what I envision this being is as the vessel would submerge, that ball would float up and seal the that pipe and prevent water from coming in, prevent water from coming into the people tank, as we would say. The objective was to affix the mine to the bottom of a ship by screwing it into the hull using a hand cranked auger from inside the vessel. And then he would submerge the vessel to release it. And finally, the mechanism itself, the mine itself, it was triggered by a timer that would further trigger the flintlock mechanism. And after a preset time, would ignite priming powder and subsequently the priming charge. Okay, now let's fast forward just a little bit and talk about what was going on in August of 1776. Again, the reason or the opportunity, I should say, that this new invention was brought to bear. It was the naval blockade of New York Harbor in August of 1776, just days before the Turtle would see its first action. The British Navy, under command of Admiral Richard Howe, was supporting the British Army commanded by his brother, General William Howe, by blockading New York Harbor. The combined British strategy was to push General Washington and the Continental Army up the Hudson, giving control of the Hudson River Valley to the British, and effectively splitting the colonies in two and bringing the revolution to a speedy close. On August 22nd, 1776, the British landed on Long Island with 32,000 British regulars, 10 ships of the line, 20 frigates, and 170 transports. By August 27th, barely, not even a week later, Washington's troops were defeated on Long Island and they escaped to Manhattan Island. So you can just imagine the feeling of the colonies and the patriots just suffering one setback after another, looking for something to give them that push and turn the tide in this conflict. And the turtle was placed as being just such a hope. Let's talk about the mission. General Washington himself approved the turtle's first official mission, which was to break the British blockade of New York Harbor, starting with an audacious attack on the 64-gun man-of-war HMS Eagle, which was the flagship of Admiral Richard Howe. Before the mission even started, Ezra Bushnell, who was the pilot, he was the only trained pilot, fell ill, as luck would have it, and on the eve of that initially planned attack. So Bushnell had to postpone the mission as well as find and train another pilot. So he retreated with the turtle into the Long Island Sound and back to the Connecticut River area. Bushnell solicited the Continental Army for volunteers. Sergeant Ezra Lee was selected as the replacement and his training began. But with the urgency of the situation in New York Harbor, Lee's training was reduced to only 2 weeks, and the mission was rescheduled for September 6th. So here we are. Picture it. Imagine a first-of-a-kind vessel on a first-of-a-kind mission. The pilot, who was familiar with the vessel, had to be replaced with someone who knew nothing about it and was given only 2 weeks of training. The vessel had only 30 minutes of air when fully submerged. So what would happen? I'm sorry, is there a question?
No, we're just following along.
Oh, you got
Yeah,
it. You got it.
yeah.
So, there's only 30 minutes of air. So if they get stuck underneath a ship and can't get out, what would they do? Uh, so it was just a harrowing situation and so many unknown factors and variables. Propulsion was manual and arduous. and exhaustion was inevitable. Add to that the fact that the vessel was an upside down egg shape, so any wave action was going to affect the vessel and make it unstable and add to the pilot's physical exhaustion. It'd be dark inside the turtle, especially at night. Would the pilot be able to see the compass or read the depth gauge? The admiral's flagship would have been heavily guarded. Detection and or capture was a very strong possibility, or perhaps even a worse fate would have met Lee. The odds were stacked against them. So here we go. On the evening of September 6th of 1776 at 11 p.m., Ezra Lee and the Turtle were towed out into New York Harbor by a small boat as close as possible to the target without being detected. Once released, the Turtle was immediately affected by the tidal currents and wave action. He turned the propeller by hand and rocked the treadles back and forth for 2.5 hours, trying to maintain course, but to no avail as the vessel was swept off track and away from the target. When the currents eased, though, he was able to maneuver the Turtle close enough to the Eagle to hear men talking on deck. The sun was starting to come up as he shut the hatch and submerged, positioning the Turtle beneath the Eagle. Lee attempted to penetrate the hull of the Eagle with the auger in order to attach the explosive device, but he couldn't penetrate the hull. After another unsuccessful attempt and short on air and with the sun coming up, Lee abandoned the mission, maneuvered away from the Eagle, and made for shore. And he later found out, by the way, that the reason he couldn't penetrate this hull is because the Eagle had recently been fitted with copper plating to ward off parasites and barnacles. So, what if, right? What if? On the Turtle's retreat, the British small boats spotted it, of course. Lee jettisoned the mine and later recalled, quote, that he, quote, let loose the magazine in hopes that if they should take me, they should likewise pick up the magazine and then we should all be blown up together, end quote. The mine did explode at its 1 hour set point as it drifted past Governor's Island and into the East River, frightening Lee's pursuers and allowing Lee and the Turtle to escape to fight another day. Other attempts. Lee was again unsuccessful on October 5th of 1776 in an attempt to blow up a ship on the Hudson River. The British were definitely on high alert at this point after this first attempt, and on this occasion, the Turtle was spotted and it was swept off target by tidal currents. Phineas Pratt, who was, as we mentioned, Bushnell's colleague from his days at Yale, in the meantime had also become trained as a pilot. And he also was spotted in the moonlight on another mission. Within days of these attacks, the transport ship that was ferrying the Turtle to another location came under gunfire from the British and was sunk. The Turtle was recovered, but was later dismantled by Bushnell out of concern it would fall into the hands of the British. Bushnell did go on to develop other types of mines that didn't require delivery by a submarine and was successful in that endeavor in New London Harbor and on the Delaware River. So the question that we want to pose is, was it a failure? When taking everything into account and all in spite of all the setbacks and challenges that were faced, I would propose that it was not. The HMS Eagle was relocated to safer waters as a result of the submerged threat. The British were given something to be concerned about, so they knew it wasn't going to be a cakewalk at this point. They had to allocate resources that were needed elsewhere to guard against this new threat. Bushnell's mine design was, as I mentioned later, successfully used. These inventions inspired future military strategists on the use of submarines in warfare. And the operational principles applicable to today's submarines, such as the snorkel valve, the expulsion of water to surface and submerge the ship, use of screw propellers on propulsion on a seagoing vessel. That in and of itself shows the impact that Mr. Bushnell and his invention had on history. So Mr. Bushnell was not done with after the turtle was no longer in existence, after he had to dismantle it. He was later awarded a commission in the Continental Army, Corps of Engineers by General Washington, saying that Bushnell was, quote, a man of great mechanical powers, fertile in invention, and a master of execution, end quote. He went on to say about the turtle project, quote, I thought and still think that it was an effort of genius, but that too many things were necessary to be combined to expect much from the issue against an enemy who were always on guard, end quote. After the war, David Bushnell corresponded with Thomas Jefferson in 1787, detailing the submarine and underwater mine inventions. A few years later, in 1798, 22 years after the first mission, the future president was giving a presentation and made public for the very first time the existence of these two inventions, the mine and the turtle. From that point on, Bushnell became known as the father of submarine warfare. Two submarine tenders were named after him, one in World War I and one in World War II. And I found this photo as I was going through my research, and it reads, in commemoration, Captain David Bushnell, patriot of the Revolutionary War, born 1740 in Connecticut, died 1826 in Georgia, creator of America's first wartime submarine, the Turtle. And if you can read who that was placed by, it was placed by none other than a Georgia chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. So, in my closing here, I would suggest that there are several things we can learn from this story. As I stated earlier, in my opinion, this is a story about common people doing extraordinary things with a purpose and conviction. It's a story about collaboration. Though David Bushnell himself was a brilliant person, he needed additional capabilities, skills, and craftsmanship that he didn't possess. So uh, he also needed different viewpoints and someone to suggest why something would or wouldn't work. It's a story about critical thinking to think through the whys and what ifs when creating something from scratch. It's a story about stick-to-itiveness, or otherwise known as if at first you don't succeed. Overcoming adversity one after the other and continuing the mission. It's okay to fail, but learning from the failure is a bonus. Freedom begets greatness. This is my last point. This is a story, in my opinion, about freedom where people can thrive and achieve without being told exactly what to say, what to do, or how to do it. It's freedom of thought, freedom of expression and exploration, and being allowed to take risks and try something that hasn't been done before. Not being afraid of failure and giving consideration to different opinions. And so with that, I am happy to take questions.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Is Bushnell buried in Connecticut?
In Georgia.
Georgia.
He is buried in, I'm not sure what town, did it say what town was on that? I don't think it did. He is, died in Georgia. Well, he died in Georgia. Doesn't mean he was buried there necessarily. The same question came up here, as a matter of fact, in our local chapter here in Florida. There's a Bushnell National Cemetery just north of us. And I've made it a point to figure out someday whether that was actually related to him or not.
Question.
Yes.
Have you seen the quarter scale model we have at the museum, SAR Museum in Louisville?
I have not, but I have visited while I was actually stationed in Groton, Connecticut at the Submarine Museum, a full-scale mock-up of the turtle. But I have not seen the one at the SAR Museum.
Other question. I
Please.
have two. The first one is does the blueprint for this original one still exist? Is that how they made that, the recreation of it later on you were talking about? So they got the original blueprints of this?
They must have had some drawings, whether it was an original blueprint or not, I'm not sure. But through various artifacts, I'm sure they were able to come to figure out what the dimensions were, the various materials that he used, etc. Particularly since the Naval Academy was involved, I'm sure that contribution would have made sure that it was pretty authentic.
My other question was then, just a curiosity question.
Mhm.
Flanking on the sides, does that go vertical or horizontal?
It was vertical, I believe. It looks vertical, yeah.
Quick question for you. I am also a submarine officer, 2 fast attack tours to my name. And the question I could never answer, because you're not allowed to, is how deep our submarines go these days. How deep could the turtle go, if you're allowed to answer that?
Super question. I'm sure there weren't any R&D tests done, nor were there sub-safe systems to test QA and all that while running through this. That's a great question. I'm not sure. It would obviously be limited to the strength of the materials, etc. And all these. I wouldn't want to go deeper than maybe 100 feet in it. That's a great question. I didn't run across anything about how deep it would go.
You can go all the way to the bottom.
All the way to the bottom. There you go. That's the answer.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just a question. How, based on the propulsion speed and the amount of air, time that you have, how far, what's the maximum distance that you could be from your target before you, or when you submerged? You close the hatch and submerged. Like, how far away could he be?
Well, if we could do some quick math. I used to do math much quicker. At 3 mile an hour, 30 minutes worth of air, I would imagine air was the only limitation in no current, no waves, and everything working fine. So whatever.
The 30-minute must be there and back, right? So like you got to get there.
Oh, that's a great point. So he wanted to submerge before they could hear him or see him.
Yeah, okay.
But someone these days that's better with math and has a calculator might be able to. But that's a great question. I mean, you had to be towed out a certain way, a certain distance from shore. Then you had to figure out how long, taking into account currents, and again, how much wave action was out there, and figure out how far it would be from that point to get to the ship, and then submerge time. And obviously, they did all this at night.
Yeah.
I had that one picture that I had there. Let me see if I can get that back up there. It shows you how much it's stuck above. Above the surface, so it wasn't exactly stealthy.
Yeah, right.
Any other questions?
Very interesting.
Bill, that was just a fascinating presentation, very well done. A great story of technology and innovation and a great story of bravery. Thank you for all the research you've done on this, and thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.